This is Dave with Taboo Customs. Today we're taking a look at the install of our Jeep YJ rear frame rust repair kit. The Jeep we've got here is a 95 Jeep YJ, and it's showing the typical rust that you'll get at the rear end of the frame. The big issue with this rust versus something like the TJs that will also rust in the same area is that you've got your shackle hanger for the rear leaf spring inside the rear of the frame. So this one here is pretty much typical of what most YJs will look like. You'll see that it starts to rust here at the bottom because all that silt and debris get trapped down here and is then unable to get out of the frame, so it starts to develop these big holes. This side here is pretty bad. You can see it's rusted all the way through for about 8-9 inches. The rear, the other side isn't so bad. The other side is starting to develop some of the small holes, but it really hasn't gone through the frame like it has on this side. So we'll go through and we'll do the installation of our kit, and we'll show you how that's done. So let's take a look at the YJ kit that you will receive. This kit will have three main pieces. The first largest piece will be the outside plate for the frame. Then you'll have the inside plate, which is a bit shorter than the outside plate. And then you'll have the bottom plate, which is currently straight, but as we do the installation, we'll actually bend this plate so that it follows the contour of the bottom of the frame. In addition to that, you'll get several pieces that are going to be used to reinforce the kit to the rear cross member. The first couple pieces here, you'll get two sets of plates that will go against the rear cross member. One plate for the inside, one plate for the outside. Then in addition to that, you'll get several pieces that will help to reinforce these plates to the new kit. So that was our standard YJ rust repair kit. Now we know that a lot of YJ frames will actually be worse than what we have here, and often you'll see where the shackle tube in the frame will actually rust out enough to where the shackle tube comes loose from the frame. Typically in those instances you're going to want to replace that shackle tube. So we have developed another kit to go along with this kit, and that is a kit to replace those bushing tubes. This kit includes 4 rings that will go on the inside of the frame plates. Then it includes 2 tubes, and the tubes will be to replace that bushing tube that is inside the frame. In addition to that, we do include 2 sets of new shackle bushings, and that's because typically whenever it gets to the point to where this shackle bushing tube has rusted enough to come loose from the frame, the bushings are usually not going to be any good anyway, and often in taking things apart you're going to tear them up, so we do include new bushings and new sleeves with that kit. So the biggest issues with removing parts from this Jeep are probably going to come when you go to remove the fuel tank. So with the fuel tank, there's a couple of recommendations we have. One, I would recommend actually removing the front 3 bolts in the skid plate first before you take anything else out. Now when you go to do that, you can hold the skid plate up with a pair of vice grips. What we will typically do is as we remove these bolts, we'll get a couple of them out, then we'll take a pair of vice grips and we will clamp this skid plate to the front cross member. That way it will still be held up there, but we can continue to work on the rest of the Jeep. Now one of the things when you are working on these bolts, the rear bolts are going to be carriage bolts. Typically we don't have an issue with them spinning, but sometimes you may have an issue. When you're taking these bolts out, you want to make sure that you keep the bolt head inside the rear cross member of the frame, pulled down against the rear cross member. If you don't, there's a chance that you could push that bolt upward and then it's going to start spinning, and you can wear that actual square in the carriage bolt out, and then you're going to be in for a world of hurt because those are really difficult to get to once they are wore out. The bolts in the front can also be a problem, and this one was no exception. These bolts, if they haven't been touched before, haven't been replaced ever, can be very rusted. These we actually broke 2 of the bolts off, and then the third one didn't break, but it stripped out on the top. Now unfortunately we didn't follow our own advice, and we had actually started already removing the fuel hoses, and we had fuel in a lot of places, so we didn't feel comfortable going in there and trying to cut that bolt loose with a grinder or anything like that. So what you can do if you do end up with that sort of case is you can take and center punch the bottom of the bolt. We used a small 3/32 drill bit to drill a hole into the bolt from the bottom, and then we used a larger 5/16 drill bit to follow that up until we actually went completely through our nut and knocked the nut and the bolt out of the frame. Now, in addition to the bolts being difficult to get out, you can have difficulties with your hose clamps as well. When we do these, we'll typically remove the filler hoses from the filler neck, and the reason for that is that the filler neck is in a much easier area to access, and you can see on this Jeep the clamps for the filler hoses here were on top of the tank, so they were pretty much inaccessible for us to get to. Now when you do these, if the clamps haven't been touched, you know, pretty much forever, you're going to have a case where your screw in the clamp may look like this one, where it's full of dirt and completely rusted out. It did not have any sort of hex on the clamp face anymore. So how we remove these is we will typically take a pair of vice grips or a large pair of pliers. We will grab this clamp and the screw like this, and then we will twist to break this housing off for that screw. And you can see this one here, how we took and we actually twisted it in this area, pulled away, and it pulled the screw out, so we're able to remove the clamp. So, to start the install, the first thing we had to do was we wanted to make a little bit of space between the spring and the bottom of the frame. Whenever we removed the shackle, the spring actually went up against the bottom of the frame, so we went and we took a scissor jack, we put a scissor jack in here next to the axle and up to the center of the bend of the frame to give us a little bit of space back here, about 1/4 inch or so, to be able to work with the plates. Next, we're going to need to start to remove the rusted sections of the frame that we don't want to retain. These areas down here, these corners, aren't going to be doing anything for us structurally, and in addition, this is actually bowed out, so it's going to keep us from getting our plate up against the frame. So we're going to go through and we're going to cut these bottom corners out. We looked at replacing the shackle bushing tubes on this frame. However, there's a couple of reasons we decided not to. One, the top section of this frame is still really solid. The bushing tube is still connected to over half of that top section of the frame, so it's still in there pretty well. In addition to that, whenever you're replacing the bushing tubes, there's a bit of an issue with what type of shackle you're using. If you're using a one-piece shackle like this that is connected from both sides, it can be a bit of an issue, because with adding the plates on each side of the frame, you make the bushings, you'll push the bushings out a little bit farther, especially with the tube, because we have to make that tube a little bit longer to reach that new material there. So when you do that, you'll actually make this shackle need to be 1/16 to 1/8 wider. So with this, you would either, if you wanted to use the new bushing tubes with this Jeep, you'd either need to switch to a shackle that was 2-piece, basically an inside and an outside piece like stock, or you would need to cut this piece out or cut it out and you could just lengthen it. So now we've gone in, we've cut out these bottom corners of the frame, we've cleaned out all the debris and the rust and the mud from the inside of the frame, and we're ready to start laying out our parts on the frame. The goal here is basically to lay out the perimeter of the parts and the areas that we're going to want to weld, and then we'll go in, we'll have to clean those up as much as possible. We want to make sure they're clean, because if you leave any kind of dirt or debris in that area, it's going to cause you to have poor welds. So it's going to cause porosity and issues with your welding, and our goal is to get as much of it welded as possible. There's a good chance that because it is a rusted frame, there might be sections that don't turn out real good as far as welding. But in the end, I mean, we want to try to get as much as possible. That way we can account for any kind of issues that we might run into in some of the smaller sections. So when laying out these plates, the inside plate and the outside frame plate, you're going to want to make sure you center those plates on the shackle bushing tube. Now with that, when you do that, there might be some grinding or some notching that you have to do to make sure that the plates do lay out correctly and lay out flush to the frame, flat to the frame, and are on there. Then what you can do is on each part take and mark out the perimeter of the part. You can do that for the outside plate, the inside plate, these two plates back here at the back of the frame, and you can also take and do it for this bottom plate. Now the bottom plate will butt up against the bottom of the rear cross member and then come up to the frame, and as we weld this, we'll actually bend it up to the frame, and you'll want to go in here and mark out where you're going to weld across the bottom of the frame. Once you have that, we'll go in and we'll start cleaning up the frame. Now in cleaning up these frames, what we'll typically use is we'll use a lot of different items. We'll use a needle scaler. If you have a needle scaler, to remove a lot of the large and heavy scale that you might have on the frame. Then we will typically wire wheel the entire perimeter, try to make sure we get all the loose scale and what was left on there off. And then we'll either go in with a die grinder and make sure we get down to good metal, either a die grinder with a small disc, or in areas like this area back here in this corner, we'll go in with a die grinder with a bit on it to go in there and try to remove as much of the dirt and debris as we can. Before we get to welding our standard rust repair kit on the YJ here, we'll take a look at what to do if you're using the optional bushing tube kit that you can get if you're replacing this shackle bushing tube here. Obviously you'd have to remove the shackle bushing tube to do it. To do that, you're going to want to cut around this larger area here that's dimpled in up to about a ½ inch from the top of the frame. Then after you do that, you're going to take your inside and your outside plates, and you'll need to determine on these plates which part of the plate is actually going against the frame. So for this side, obviously it'll be like this. You're going to want to then take these parts, weld them to the inside of these plates, making them concentric with the holes that are on these plates on the outside. Then you can take these plates and kind of do like we're going to do here shortly and put the plates on the inside and the outside frame. You can then use your shackle bushing tube to line up both of those holes. You can then either tack the plates to the frame. You don't want to weld them very much, but you can tack them to the frame, or you can clamp them to the frame. And then you're going to want to install the bottom plate. You get the bottom plate installed, and then you can tack the bottom plate and the two side plates together. Then we'd actually recommend that you remove that whole assembly and finish weld all of the inside of the bushing tube to make sure that you get good welding and good strength on that bushing tube. So for the next step of the installation, we'll start tacking our plates on our frame. We've gone in, we've cleaned up the frame, obviously focusing around the perimeter of the frame up here, and then doing a lot of cleanup back here. And back here it's really hard, but if you do get one area clean, you want to try to make sure you get this area around the shackle tube as clean as possible, because one of the things we're going to want to do is make sure we add some structure back between the shackle tube and the frame, because it is what's supporting the Jeep on the suspension. What we'll do, we'll take our plate, we'll center it on the hole again, line it up with the bottom of the frame here, and then we'll use a C-clamp to hold it in place. What we can do is, while you get that C-clamp in place, our hammer, line it back up. Now we can tack this in place in a few places, and then we'll do the same thing on the inside. So now we've got our outside plate and our inside plate tack welded to the frame. We're going to want to start working on the bottom plate. Now at the bottom plate there's a couple of slots in the plate. This closest slot will go towards the rear. The reason for those slots is to clean out the frame. You know, once you start getting more mud and debris in here, it's just going to have the same issues. These large slots here to help you to be able to wash that frame out and get that debris out. Now to install this plate, you're going to want to butt it up against the cross member, the edge of the rear cross member, and then it will go, the top of the plate will be level with the bottom of the outside plate, and the edge of the plate here will go against the inside of the outside plate. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to take a place, I'm going to put a tack here and a tack here. I'm going to use my C-clamp then and try to close up these two plates as much as possible. The reason being is that because we're adding these plates, we're adding that extra thickness, we need to make sure that our shackle will clear as much as possible. And because this is a one-piece shackle, it's going to be more critical. If it's a two-piece, we could actually use some washers to space those shackle plates out, but with a one-piece shackle, we're going to want to make sure we have enough clearance. So now I've got our bottom plate tacked in a couple of spots on the inside and a couple of spots on the outside. If you've done this correctly, down here on both the inside and the outside, you'll have a joint that should look somewhat like that. That way it gives you a good square area to put a good sized fillet weld along both bottom sides there. The next step you want to do is basically pulling this front of the bottom piece up to the frame. You can do that, it's pretty flexible, you can do that in a couple of ways. You know, the easiest way is going to be with a large C-clamp. You can put a large C-clamp on it, start to pull it up to the frame, and then you'll still want to use your smaller C-clamp to make sure that both the inside and the outside plates are correctly aligned to the bottom plate. So as you pull it up, you can continue to tack it along the edges of the bottom until you get all the way to the top. So we've got our bottom plate all tacked in and bent and welded up now. So now the next area to start working on is going to be the area around the tube for the shackle bushings. Now as you can see, this plate currently sits quite a ways off from this tube, so we're going to want to try to get that plate in as close as possible. One of the things you can do is take a couple of big C-clamps and put it around here to try to pull the inside area of this plate in to make sure it's close. Then you can make sure that you've got a pretty solid tacks or welds around this area because you don't want this plate to bounce. What I'll then do is take a ball peen hammer and I'll start in the closest spot to the tube and I will hammer that area in as far as I can get it to the tube and place a weld. Once I get that weld in there, that weld will start to heat up the material around where it was, making it easier for me to start taking that material and hammering it down into the area where the tube is at. So I've taken my two large C-clamps, and I've put them on either side of the bushing tube for the shackle, and I've clamped them down as tight as I can get them. And now you can see, after a little bit of hammering, I've actually got the bottom section of this plate to where it's either flush or below the face of that tube. And that's really what you want, because you're not going to want to add much thickness to that tube, because it's really going to affect your shackle and how wide the bushings are coming out of that tube. So now that I have this, I can go in and I'll start welding over here, and then probably try to hammer a little bit more of this in once I heat up this material a little bit. So we've got our bushing tube all welded into our inner and outer plates. And one of the things I didn't mention, really can be key in making that successful, is making sure you've got some big, good C-clamps. If you got cheap C-clamps that are going to strip out, it's going to be more difficult for you. If you have some larger C-clamps, you can really, crank down on and pull those two plates in. It helps out immensely. The next step, and the final step really, is to install the two plates on the rear cross member. Now there are 4 plates that come with the kit, and they're 2 different shapes, and you can see one has an angle at the top of it. That angled plate goes on the inside, the one with the straight top goes on the outside. So what you're going to want to do is, for both plates, take and make sure that you're lining your bolt holes up with the plate and getting it as flush as possible. Now sometimes you'll end up with a gap here. Depends on the frame, depends on where the cross member is at. So even though there's no gap here, what I'm going to do is I'm still going to go ahead and use my 3/8 bar. I'm going to take the 3/8 bar, put it in there, solid weld both sides of that 3/8 bar. Once that's done, I'll take my gusset and I'll put my gusset in there, and I typically will put this gusset about in the middle of the bolts. So that way I can ensure that I've got sufficient strength and sufficient reinforcement now for my rear cross member for any tire carrier bumper mounting. So we've got our inside and our outside plates and everything else put into place now, and we've welded everything complete. Now with these rear plates to the rear cross member, I typically do not weld the plate to the rear cross member. We're bolting to the rear cross member, and we're welding pretty solidly to these inside and outside plates, and it's really meant as a reinforcement for this cross member to these plates, because these welds down here to the original frame were getting pretty bad. So now we've got it done, we can go in and start cleaning up all of our spatter, getting ready to paint. We'll want to take and we'll want to probably clean up these faces on the inside and the outside to make sure our bushings sit as flush as possible. Now one thing you will have to deal with now that we're starting to get this put back together is you will have to figure out how to hang your exhaust. Typically there's an exhaust hanger back here. Now we would typically use just an exhaust hanger, weld it to the bottom of the frame, and then bolt it to the exhaust as it comes around for the Jeep. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped you out with either the installation of our YJ rust repair kit, or it helped to explain what the kit actually covers in case you're looking at purchasing one. If you do want to purchase one, you can go to our website, taboocustoms.com. They'll be available for purchase there. Also, if you have any feedback on your installation, as far as any issues you might have encountered or any questions you have during the installation, go to taboocustoms.com. You can contact us there or on our Facebook page and ask us any questions or let us know any feedback that you might have. Anyway, thanks for watching. If this has been helpful, please like or subscribe. It helps small businesses, and see you later.